Good evening and welcome. My name is Aaron Van Dyke. I'm an assistant professor of chemistry here at Fairfield University. I'm joined this evening by my co-host, Mark Liggis, who's Vice Provost of Undergraduate Excellence here at Fairfield. We'll tell you a little bit more about ourselves later on in the webinar, but first, a few housekeeping details. Please make sure that you've signed on to the chat in Vimeo and that you've entered your first and last name. That way you'll get credit for your FYE experience. Now, if you forgot to enter your first and last name, not to worry, you can always type it into the chat window. Mark will be moderating all of the chats, so he'll be sure to catch your name. Now, why are we here this evening? The purpose of tonight's webinar is to begin your intellectual journey here at Fairfield. We've already started by conversing with one another on Quip. I thought a good example to look at would be to actually travel back in time and see what education was predicted to look like. So take a look at this picture on your screen. In the bottom left, you'll see an image from the 1900s World Fair in Paris. There, they predicted what education would look like in the year 2000. You can see on the right-hand side a professor dumping books into a machine, turning a crank, the books being chewed up, and the information being communicated across wires through the top of the room and down into the students' heads. This kind of data dump is not the kind of education that we, the faculty, want to offer you here at Fairfield. Rather, your education is going to be a conversation, a dialogue, something that we're going to engage in here tonight. And the way that you can engage in that dialogue with us is to be sure to engage through Vimeo's chat. Again, Mark is going to be your facilitator for that chat, so be sure you keep him busy tonight. There's no such thing as a silly question. So please make sure that you send us any questions that you have about the reading and that you're an engaged participant. Now, why are we here? Again, to begin your intellectual journey, but also to prepare you for the upcoming academic gathering, which is going to be on September 4th on Bellarmine Lawn. That's shown with a red arrow. It's really beautiful. It overlooks Long Island Sound. Also, the point of tonight's conversation is for us to get to know you, the students, and for you to get to know us, the faculty, staff, and administrators who are going to be accompanying you on that intellectual journey. But first, let's have you get to know your sources. Mark, do you want to tell the viewers tonight a little bit about yourself?
Certainly. Thank you, Aaron. Good evening, class of 2022. And for those of you who are in the Western time zones, perhaps good afternoon to you still. As Aaron said, my name is Mark Liggis. I'm the Vice Provost for Undergraduate Excellence here at Fairfield University. And that, my friends, is a lot of words to basically say that I am here to work with the deans of each of your respective schools, as well as all of the faculty in those schools, to make sure that you have the best education experience possible over your 4 years. Some of you perhaps who are watching have seen me before. For those of you who are in the Dolan School of Business, I was your interim dean and I welcomed you to Fairfield. I've now been asked to move on to the university level to help with the educational experience, and I'm thrilled to do that. So I very much look forward to serving you for the next 4 years in this capacity. With that said, let me give you a little bit more about my personal and academic background. Aaron? So, I'm actually from Western Pennsylvania. Any of you from the Pennsylvania state, glad to have you aboard up here in Connecticut. I was born in a small still town, Butler, PA, about 30 miles north of Pittsburgh, and I spent all of my childhood and my teenage years there. When it was time to go to college, as opposed to leaving the state, I went to the other end of the state to Philadelphia, to the University of Pennsylvania, where I earned my Bachelor of Arts degree with a major in sociology back in 1992. Please don't hold my age against me. After that, I went on to Penn State, go Nittany Lions, for my 2-year master program. As opposed to a Master's of Business Administration, I focused on the more research-oriented Master of Science in Business Administration, and that's where I realized my passion lied in the field of marketing. From Penn State, I finally left the state, thinking that perhaps I would end up being some type of a park ranger for the state of Pennsylvania, since I've done everything there until that point. And I came to the University of Connecticut, where I earned my PhD in 2001 in business administration and officially became a marketing professor. After that, little did I know I would be 70 miles down the road here in Fairfield County at Fairfield University at the Dolan School of Business. So that's my journey, and that's what got me to Fairfield and to become a stag, and hopefully you'll be able to have a similar story to tell over the coming years. Back to you, Aaron.
Thanks, Mark. So a little bit about my story. I started off in a slightly different time zone than Mark. I was born and raised in Washington, a small apple farming town called Yakima. Like Mark, I stayed in state for my college experience. I went to Seattle University, where I earned a degree in chemistry. Seattle University is a small Jesuit institution, so Jesuit just like Fairfield is. I then hopped across to the East Coast, where I earned my PhD in organic chemistry from MIT. I then wanted to try out the middle of the country and spent some time at the University of Michigan, go Blue, where I conducted postdoctoral research for a few years. And then I was fortunate enough to come here to Fairfield, where now I teach organic chemistry and biochemistry. I'm also fortunate enough to call Fairfield's campus my home. I actually live in the brand new residence hall that we are opening this coming fall, Langguth Hall, which is home to the sophomore residential college that focuses on Ignatian leadership. So if this is something that you're interested in, an opportunity to merge your academic and your social experiences, please be sure to check us out. It's something that's available to anyone who lives on campus, as well as commuter students. So let's find out a little bit about you. Where are you joining us from tonight? Well, it looks like we have a strong showing from Connecticut, New York and New Jersey, the tri-state area, as well as Massachusetts. I see we've got some students from Mark's home state, Pennsylvania. Oh, as well as some of the American territories. So we've got a pretty wide audience here tonight. That's fantastic. In terms of what school or college you're going to be enrolling in, we've got a strong showing from the College of Arts and Sciences. That's where I reside in. We've also got a strong showing from the School of Business, where Mark comes from. Oh, I see we've got another nursing major that just joined us, which is fantastic, as well as a good showing from the School of Engineering. Let's see where students are going to be coming from this fall. Oh, looks like we've got the best turnout from Regis. Way to go, guys and gals. We also have a good showing from Jogues, Campion, and then Gonzaga, as well as our commuter students. Fantastic. Let's have you guys think ahead and imagine where you might want to study or serve abroad. Oh, it looks like it's a race between Italy and Spain right now, but also some good showings for Ireland, England, and looks like we've also got some students who might want to create their own study abroad experience. If you have ideas, let us know. We're always eager to hear them. Our story tonight is actually going to begin in Spain. Ignatius of Loyola is the founder of the Society of Jesus, which is more commonly referred to as the Jesuits. As a young man, he dreamed of chivalrous deeds, to benefit himself, though, only. Here's a picture of a key event in Ignatius's life, the Battle of Pamplona. Now, it doesn't matter if you've never heard of this experience or if you've heard about it several times. Here's a question that I want to pose to all of you. So get ready to type your response in Vimeo's chat. Does it look like Ignatius, who's pictured in the red cloak and shown by the red arrow, Does it look like Ignatius is experiencing defeat, or is Ignatius experiencing victory? And why? All you need to type is one sentence, just a brief answer. Again, is Ignatius experiencing victory, or is Ignatius experiencing defeat in this picture? Go ahead and send your responses to Mark in Vimeo's chat. You might want to think about how the picture is constructed, maybe the way people are grouped in the picture, perhaps the use of color. Mark, how are we doing? Should we give him another 30 seconds, or are we getting some responses?
Well, we got our first response, and the one point is that it looks like he's being defeated because everyone's grabbing at him. Another one, he is defeated. He's cowering in the corner. Ignatius is experiencing defeat. 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 My goodness, it's defeat.
It sounds like a resounding defeat.
Absolutely. So much defeat coming on here that I had to put on my reader so that I could see all the detail. Oh, wait. No, we've got a victory in there
one
somewhere.
victory. All right.
Yes.
We got an optimist. That's always good.
That's good to know. Absolutely.
I like the comment about the way people are grouped around him, the way someone was grabbing him. That's a great observation. Notice the individual in the bottom right-hand corner, the way that person is grasping Ignatius's arm. Also, the way Ignatius is leaning back. Notice there's no way in that posture that his body weight could be supported by his feet, right? I mean, try standing at a 45-degree angle. I'm a scientist, trust me on this, right? Try standing at a 45-degree angle and be supported by your two legs. It's not possible. What this posture is suggesting is that Ignatius has a leg injury, and that's actually what occurred at the Battle of Pamplona. One of Ignatius's legs was shattered by a cannonball. Well, after recovering from this injury, Ignatius realized that he wanted to spend his life helping others instead of only helping himself. He realized that to have the greatest effect, he needed to have a higher education. So at the age of 33, not a young man, he entered the University of Paris, and that's shown here in the painting on the left. And so as Jesuit Catholic universities, we want to be universities that educate men and women for and with others. So our goal is for you to take your education and to use it at the service of others. So based on Ignatius's experiences, he would say that you're going to have 4 key chapters in your college life. Those 4 chapters are longing, love, loss, and limitlessness. And those are also the 4 chapters that I've selected readings for you to engage with in tonight's webinar and also for the academic gathering in September. So I asked you to decide where we start tonight. I asked you, what readings did you find most engaging? Well, it looks like you found longing most engaging. So that's where we're going to start. We're going to start with chapter 1. All right, so here we see in chapter 1 the text that we decided for you to engage with was a reading by Frederick Buechner and an essay that he wrote called Message in the Stars. Frederick Buechner is an American theologian, writer, poet, and preacher. He was born in New York City, so not very far from Fairfield. And one of the key questions that he asks us to wrestle with in this essay is, what are our deepest motivations? This is a question that I actually posed to you on Quip, and thank you for so many of you for engaging with this question on Quip. We had a number of responses. What I did was I took your responses and I put them into this great website called Wordle. What it does is it collates them into a word cloud. The bigger the word, the more frequent the response. So let's take a look at what you came up with. Here's your word cloud from your responses. We can see that one of the biggest motivators for you, the class of 2022, is family, as well as love, kindness, others, success, and understanding. These are some pretty powerful motivators. One of the key passages that I'd like to spend a little time with you discussing is this passage from Message in the Stars. Let's take a chance to go through it together. For what we need to know, of course, is not just that God exists, but that there is a God right here in the thick of our day-to-day lives, who may not be writing messages about himself in the stars, but who, in one way or another, is trying to get messages through our blindness as we move around down here, knee-deep in the fragrant muck and misery and marvel of the world. It is not objective proof of God's existence that we want, but whether we use religious language for it or not, the experience of God's presence. So consider this. What Buechner suggests is that what we seek is not objective proof of God, but rather encounters with the sacred in our day-to-day lives. Remember from the text, God wrote God's name out with the stars, so there was no question about God's existence anymore. But there was a little girl who looked up into the stars and said, "So what? What's the point?" Rather, the question becomes, we crave, or Buechner would suggest, we crave an encounter with the transcendent. We may find that in tea. That's the way I start out my day every morning. Or the perfect shot. Maybe you're an athlete and there's been that game where everything is lined up so perfectly for you, it just feels like it's something bigger than yourself. Or maybe you love the outdoors and there's been a hike or a trail that you've gone on or a river that you've been kayaking down, and there's been that perfect view or vista that you've seen. And suddenly, you just feel like you're connecting to something bigger than yourself. These are the kinds of encounters and the kinds of moments that Buechner is suggesting we deeply crave. Ultimately, Ignatius and Buechner, I think, would suggest we're craving an encounter with love in our day-to-day experiences. So let's move on to chapter 2, unless you have any questions from chapter 1. So I just want to pause for about 15 seconds. And again, if you have any questions from chapter 1, remember there are no silly questions. Go ahead and send them to Mark, and we'll be happy to answer them right now. Again, if you have any questions from chapter 1, be happy to field them. Mark, do we have anything coming in?
Well, I just posed the question to them,
Great.
if they have any, and I'm waiting to see if there are any responses.
All right, we'll give you a minute to type some questions in again if you have them. And a reminder to everyone, we'll open a new page in Quip. So if there are any questions that we don't have time to answer during the webinar here this evening, we'll be sure to post follow-up answers in that Quip page. So we want to make sure that we answer all your questions. Do we have anything, Mark, or should we move on?
I think we should move on. I think they're interested in love. Certainly, that's what we got from your word cloud, so.
All right, great. Let's move on to chapter 2. So in chapter 2, there were 2 readings that I asked you to engage with. The first reading was These Poems, She Said, by Robert Bringhurst, and the second reading was Don't Change by Anthony DeMello. A little bit about these authors. Robert Binghurst is a Canadian poet and author. Anthony DeMello is a Jesuit priest from India, a writer, and a master storyteller. One of the themes that connects these two readings is the theme of authentic love and the question of what does authentic love look like? One of the reading questions I posed to you was, what do you think is happening in the poem, These Poems She Said, by Robert Binghurst? Thank you so much for your responses on Quip. There were a lot of great posts that you offered up. A lot of you touched on the great point that there's a female narrator in this poem, and she's engaging with a man, and she's essentially taking this man to task. She's criticizing him. And a lot of you had theories about the woman's motivation for criticizing this man. Ultimately, she's criticizing him because his poetry is loveless. One reason I might offer up for why his poetry is loveless is because he's never truly fallen in love. Let's take a look at the text and see what's some evidence for why this might be the case. Here's an excerpt from These Poems She Said. Let's read along. These poems are as heartless as birdsong, as unmeant as elm leaves, which if they love, love only the wide blue sky and the air and the idea of elm leaves. Self-love is an ending, she said, and not a beginning. Love means love of the thing sung, not of the song or the singing. Mark, is there a certain kind of music that you enjoy?
Absolutely. Now, class of 2022, I don't want you to laugh too hard, but I was a teenager in the 80s. So, though many of you think that was an era and a genre of music that's a bit ridiculous, remember that many of your parents, if not most, were, like me, children of the 80s. So that's definitely a favorite portion of music for me.
Okay, 80s music. Okay, great. So is there a song or an artist you might suggest I should listen to from the 80s?
Well, I think there are a few, but one that I think many of us can relate to, even if we were not born back then, Bruce Springsteen.
Oh, all right, Bruce Springsteen. Okay, I like Bruce Springsteen. I have heard The Boss. So if I like Bruce Springsteen, I am a fan of 80s music.
Well,
I mean, he's from the 80s, right?
he is from the 80s, but he has, let's say, one genre of music in the 80s. He's known as a rock musician. That's one element of 80s music, but there are many others that come through many other artists.
I see. Okay. So I think what Mark is illustrating here is maybe the same idea that the woman in the poem is trying to get at with this line, right? Just because I love a song from the 80s doesn't mean I love all 80s music then?
I think that's a very good point and a very good analogy, because if you think about Madonna, we're talking pop music.
Right.
If you think about Prince, you're talking about more of an electronic, synthesized, alternative music. So you have many different genres. To hear just one doesn't necessarily make you a lover of all.
Okay. So maybe we could think about this as maybe a narrow kind of love. All right.
I think so.
Yeah. Okay. So that kind of narrow love, I think, is what the poet is trying to get at in the first reading we encountered. let's contrast that kind of narrow love with the broader, more authentic kind of love that Anthony DeMello introduces us to in his reading. Here's an excerpt that I think is especially important. He says, "I was neurotic for years. I was anxious and depressed and selfish. Everyone kept telling me to change. Then, one day he said to me, 'Don't change. I love you just as you are.' I relaxed. I came alive, and suddenly I changed. Now I know that I couldn't really change until I found someone who would love me whether I changed or not." One of the things that I think DeMello is getting at in this story that you've read is that genuine, authentic love has to begin with the individual. It has to begin with the self. You have to discover a healthy self-love before you can engage in a healthy, loving relationship with those around you. And that's something that certainly in the residential college, we explore a lot. What does it look like to find self-acceptance? Unfortunately, not every day is perfect, and that's something you already know, and that's something Ignatius knew as well. So that's why chapter 3 is unfortunately loss. For chapter 3, I asked you to engage with a text from Christian Wyman. He, I think, is a really fantastic author because in his book, he doesn't give us necessarily answers to really deep, transcendent questions, but rather he asks us to wrestle alongside him with these questions. He's an American poet and essayist, someone who has struggled with a lifelong illness. And it's from that illness that I think a lot of his writing gets its poignancy. Here is a quote from Christian from an interview that he gave in 2009. He says, "I have no illusions about adding to sophisticated theological thinking. But I think there are a ton of people out there who are what you might call unbelieving believers, people whose consciousness is completely modern, and yet who have this strong spiritual hunger in them. I would like to say something helpful to these people." Again, Christian Wyman is not trying to convince anyone of anything. He's not trying to convert anyone. He is simply trying to offer his authentic struggle with his identity and his faith, and asks us to engage in that and ask similar questions of ourselves. Here's a particularly poignant excerpt from My Bright Abyss that I think will be good for us to engage with. He says, "Forget religion. Even atheists want to die well, or want those they love to die well, which has to mean more than simply a quiet resignation to complete annihilation. No, to die well, even for the religious, is to accept not only our own terror and sadness, but the terrible holes we leave in the lives of others. At the same time, to die well, even for the atheist, is to believe that there is some way of dying into life, rather than simply away from it. Some form of survival that love makes possible." So I think what Wyman is getting at is that some days there are holes we carry inside ourselves or holes we create in others. That reading, you might recall, was taken from a passage where he was discussing the death of his great aunt and his grandmother. Certainly a deep hole that would create in anyone. What are some of the holes you might experience here at Fairfield? Anxiety about classes, living up to others' expectations, concerns about the future, maybe clubs that you're trying to get involved with, research opportunities you're trying to partake in, or internships that are in your future, maybe friction with friends. Ultimately, though, I think Wyman would say it's love that sustains us. And this is actually the genius of Ignatius's 4 chapters. He intentionally puts love before loss. Here was a question that I posed to you on Quip. And again, thank you for so many of you engaging with this question. The question that I asked was, rooted in love, what sustains you in times of loss and grief? I again collated your answers and made a word cloud. Here are your responses, the class of 2022. Overwhelmingly, you said family and you said friends, as well as parents, music, siblings, media. One thing I want you to notice is the frequency with which you referenced individual people, right? Family, friends. One thing I want you to know is that Fairfield stands with you. The faculty, the staff, the administrators, we are here to support you in your academic and social journey. One thing that you can do to combat loss is build relationships. So please reach out anytime you need support.
Aaron, if I could just
Yeah.
chime in for 1 minute. When we began the webinar, you asked all of them about the picture of St. Ignatius of Loyola.
Yeah.
And as we were joking, many of them said defeat. But one of the comments from one of you out there, thank you so much, said, you have to be defeated in order to be victorious. And I think that now that you are focusing on loss, this seems very poignant, especially in the sense of the students joining us this fall. There will be difficulties, but it's through the difficulties that you will find connections and relationships and support. So sometimes the negativity must occur in order for the end result to be positive.
That's a great point. And actually, it was a student, Jack, who on Quip, he posted this really interesting comment. He said, one of the funny things about death is that there's the passing of an individual, but at the same time, you get to reconnect with so many family members. Right. And I thought that was a really beautiful way to think about that kind of dying into life. So,
well put.
Yeah, thanks for that, Mark.
Sure.
One of the other reading questions that I asked you to think about was this question. There are resume virtues, which are virtues that we think about in terms of skills for a job, and then there are eulogy virtues, which we think about as character traits, things that we will be remembered for. And I asked you, what are some eulogy virtues that you would like to build during your time here at Fairfield? Here are some examples that you, again, posted on Quip. You said that you want to be known as a class that is friendly, trustworthy, accepting, honest, considerate, hardworking, service-oriented. One thing I was really struck by was the number of people who said they want to accept and understand those who are different from themselves. So here's a question that I'd like to pose to you, the viewers. What's one thing that you can do to meet someone different from yourself your first week at Fairfield? Again, What's one thing you can do to meet someone different from yourself your first week at Fairfield? Give you a minute to go ahead and type in your responses. You might want to think about maybe this is something that you'll do in your residence hall. Maybe it'll be something that you do in the classroom. Perhaps if you're in a club sport or a varsity sport, maybe it's something you'll do in that arena. The Tully is another place that you might want to think about taking an action. Again, what's one thing you can do to meet someone different from yourself your first week at Fairfield? Mark, what are some of the ideas that we're getting?
They are really responding to this, and clearly all of you got the message when you were here for Fairfield in Focus and when you came to orientation. Joining a club, putting yourself out there, meeting people that you would never talk to, just starting a conversation, something as simple as that, quite impressive. Don't be afraid to say hi. Absolutely, because others are in the same situation as you. So why not put yourself out there? This is in many ways a new start to introduce you to a whole different group of folks. Do more to be outgoing. We are all in the same boat. Excellent, right? Take the initiative to talk to lots of people.
That's fantastic. Good. And please don't be afraid to say hello to your professors either. We are real people. We like to get to know you. Well, that brings us to Chapter 4, Limitlessness. Every period of loss will end, and when it does, you're going to emerge into a period of limitlessness. This limitlessness is an opportunity to think about opportunities, right? So you can consider maybe your senior year, all the different job prospects that are going to be laying out before you. Or maybe even your sophomore year, all the different places that you could consider living. Maybe a residence hall that's part of a res college, or maybe down in the village. Limitlessness poses a challenge for us. And here is the challenge. How do we choose between multiple goods? Well, the author that is going to be our guide for this is Anthony DeMello, someone who you've already met. The theme for this chapter is discernment, which is essentially selecting the best option between several goods. The first thing to understand about discernment is it's never choosing between a good and a bad. So, for example, you'd never want to discern between robbing a bank and not robbing a bank. It's not a discernible option. But maybe you'd want to discern between different kinds of majors, or perhaps you'd want to discern between different study abroad opportunities. The first thing that you have to figure out, though, in the process of discernment is what helps yourself. Because what helps you may not help me. To illustrate that, let's consider DeMello's Donkey in the River story. If you recall, this was a somewhat humorous story where a donkey is packed up with salt to go to the market. And as the donkey wades into a river on the way to the market, the salt dissolves. On the second trip, the donkey is packed up with cotton. And the donkey remembers, this was a lot easier by going through the river, so I'm going to lighten my load by going through this river. But what happens to cotton when it gets wet? It gets heavier. And unfortunately, the donkey meets a sad end. The point of the story is, what's good for one donkey is not good for another. In other words, what's good for you may not be good for me. So that's why I asked you this question. What makes you come alive? And boy, did we get a variety of answers. You said running races, traveling to new places, working with children, seeing small projects add up to bigger projects, reading good books, service projects, listening to music, volunteering, being part of a church or a faith community. Now, right off the bat, running races, that's something that would probably kill me. So that's not something I'm going to do, but I'm glad that it brings life to so many of you. So again, the first part of discernment is getting to know what brings you individual life. And this provides us an opportunity to tie it all together. So remember our first chapter, our chapter on longing? What was my deepest motivation? Well, it turns out that your deepest motivation, your deepest desire, that shapes your values. And your values will inform what your best decision is going to be. Your deepest motivation helps you choose from a variety of possible goods what is the best good for me. Now, just to recap, from longing is fulfilled by love. And when we experience love, it cultivates an attitude of generosity in us. Generosity is the proper response to experiencing love. Because love sustains us in periods of loss, and it's a reality of life. We're all going to go through periods of loss. But loss, in some ways, is important because it carves our memory. It carves in our memory that we should be men and women for and with others. Because when we suffer, it reminds us that we have an opportunity to alleviate the suffering of others and to work for a more just world. One way that you can explore these questions deeper into your sophomore year is to become part of a sophomore residential college. There are 3 questions that we explore in the sophomore residential college. The first question is, who am I? Which really answers or explores this question of longing. What is my deepest motivation? The second question we ask is, whose am I? Who is my community? Who do I love? Who loves me? And who sustains me in periods of loss? And the third question is, how am I called? When I look at the variety of options that lie ahead of me going into junior year and beyond, how do I choose the option that's best for me? I hope you'll consider being a part of one of our residential colleges. Applications open in December, and there'll be more information about it during the fall semester. So with that, Mark, is there anything that you'd like to say, or do we have any other questions that our students have typed into us?
I think we're good on this end. Class of 2022, thank you so much for being so alive and so, pardon the pun, chatty. We really appreciate it. I just wanted to reiterate what I chatted back with many of you, that there were a few questions that came up and a few observations that came up that perhaps were not shared during the webinar. Please note that Aaron will have all of this information because he will be pulling it together as he does the other 2 webinars over the remainder of the summer and incorporating it into his first year gathering speech that he will be giving when he addresses you and officially welcomes you to Fairfield. So we are using the information. Everything here has been very useful and very important, and thank you so much for chiming in. It really means a lot to us, and we can't wait from the academic division to work with you, certainly in the first semester, but throughout your 4 years at Fairfield.
Wonderful. All right. Thank you again for joining us, and have a great evening.
Good night.